Welcome to the garage of our house and to my model layout of KIllin Ballachulish. It's a 00 gauge layout with DCC control powered by a wired NCE power cab system and point operation using EasyBus. The track is Pico Streamline code 75 with all the points being Electro Frog. I started to build it in 2013 when we lived 11 miles south of Inverary, and it's been ongoing since. When we decided to move here, it was, of course, packed up for the move and was re-erected here in the garage, although it had to be a bit shortened to fit the length I had available. As you can see, it's an end-to-end layout with KIllin Station at one end and Ballachulish Station at the other. It's 16 feet long and a couple of feet wide. There's some scenic interest between the two stations with a farm track bridge over the single track to help to separate the two ends. So, how is the layout constructed and how did it develop? I'll take you through a number of aspects of the layout, and I'll cover my choice of locations, baseboard construction, how I planned the two stations, control of the points, pre-EasyBus and with EasyBus, a little bit about some of the buildings, some of the additional circuitry I used, and finally mention of signals, locos and decoders. When I restarted my railway modelling hobby in 2013, after 30 years or so away from it, I was fired up by a visit to Model Rail Scotland at the SCC. On reflection, I realised that I'd only a small collection of 00 gauge stock from the 1980s, so I was going to have to start almost from scratch, buying locos, track and running stock. As far as control was concerned, going for DCC was for me an obvious choice. For anyone starting off with DCC and a large number of locos to chip, it can become very expensive. But for me, it was a no-brainer with only one old loco to chip with a decoder, a Great Western Region Dean's Goods that I built from a case kit back in 1970. And so I started off by purchasing a GaugeMaster Prodigy system, which I recently replaced with the NCE power cab, a few yards of track, a Bachmann 060 LMS Ginty, and a couple of Bachmann LMS Mark I corridor coaches. I planned an end-to-end layout, or end-to-fiddle yard as it started off, a fairly simple design which fitted the space that I'd got, 1'8" wide and about 9 feet long. All that I then needed was inspiration to come up with a suitable track plan and hopefully a real authentic location to base it on. The location turned out to be KIllin after a visit there and a walk along the extension of the old track bed, perhaps a further mile or so beyond the station down to Loch Tay. Just a bit of history here. The original KIllin station opened in 1870 on the Callander and Oban Railway, shown in blue on this map, although the full line was not opened to Oban until 1886. But that original KIllin station was actually at Glenogle Head. That was as far as the line went at that stage, but it was still nearly 5 miles from the actual village and accessed via a very steep and rugged track. Eventually, the villagers were so frustrated by the refusal to build an extension down to KIllin that they decided to fund it themselves and actually succeeded in raising enough money. The line was eventually planned from further west and at a lower altitude. At the newly named KIllin Junction, the new line, shown in red, branched off for 4 miles down to the village and to Loch Tay, at a very steep gradient of 1 in 50. Passenger trains were not normally longer than one or two coaches. The original then is little more than a single track through KIllin Station itself, as you can see from these old pictures. But it captured my imagination, a fairly quiet rural setting with some passenger and freight possibilities. The name KIllin has stuck with the station in spite of my track layout being greatly expanded with help from an old book of C.J. Freezer plans. In fact, there's very little left of KIllin at all. Well, so much for authenticity, at least on that part of the layout. My initial baseboard constructions used 9mm MDF board strengthened by 2x1 softwood bearers. Many people decry the use of MDF because of its tendency to flex and also the difficulty of putting in track pins. But so far, for me, there have been no problems. The layout has always been in a dry atmosphere, which of course has greatly helped. Maybe if I were starting again, I would choose 9mm ply as being more stable. Later, I took the opportunity to redesign the baseboard frames. I strengthened them by using 9mm by 75mm plywood frames, using a method described by Alistair Higgins in one of the meetings some years ago in the Scout Hall in Glasgow. That process was very well worthwhile and worked well, so my thanks to Alistair. The picture here shows one of the basic frames before the baseboard itself was reattached. The C.J. Freezer plan that I came up with was based on an L shape, and the station had an island platform. One line into the station has a terminal head shunt, and the other is a bay platform. There's a goods shed, loco shed, small signal box, and cattle pens. Out of the station, the line curved round the corner into what was basically a fiddle yard. Sadly, I had to omit the turntable in the original plan. It would have been useful, but there wasn't much room, and it would have been awkward to operate and to get at it if there were problems. This is an older video from 2014 with my first loco, the Great Western Region Dean's Goods. What a Great Western Region loco is doing heading up a local passenger train in Scotland on a Caledonian line, I've no idea. In the bay platform is my Bachmann LMS Ginty. Since then, the station has actually been tidied up quite a bit. A bit of a detail for those who might be interested, the station building is a Metcalfe kit. The engine shed is scale scenes, and the goods shed is a plastic wheels kit. There were to be 10 points. I had decided on Pico Streamline Code 75 track. I wanted gentle curves. I didn't want points that were any tighter than 3 foot radius, and if I could, I'd stick to 5 foot to make it more realistic. As far as point motors were concerned, I decided at that early stage to go with DCC Concepts Cobalt motors on the basis that they were slow and more prototypical than the Pico or Seep Snap type. Of course, at that time, I hadn't joined Merg, so I wasn't familiar with the servo motors and control systems. That was to change, and I'll say a bit more about the operation of the motors shortly. Going back to the KIllin fiddle yard, to make its operation a bit more workable, I made it into a sector plate, and a still frame from the beginning of the same 2014 video that I showed earlier shows part of the sector plate at the fiddle yard. Not a very clear photograph, I'm afraid, but it's the only one I've got. The sector plate was hinged at the right-hand end and could be manually turned round so that any of the 4 sidings on the plate, which were about 2'6" long, could be lined up with the single track approaching it. Additionally, built into the sector plate at the hinge end was a second mini sector plate, a sector plate within a sector plate if you like, which enabled an escape route for a loco at the buffers. You can see how it worked in this diagram. It means that you can draw a train onto the main plate, uncouple the loco, move the loco onto the mini sector plate, realign the mini plate to a free exit road, and then reverse it off to eventually reconnect at the other end of the train. You could, of course, use a mini turntable instead of a mini sector plate, which might give even more flexibility. Now, just thinking of how I controlled the point motors, I'd built a mimic control panel with 10 switches and the 20 or so LEDs indicating point direction. As a result, when I'd wired up the point motors, there were something like 30 wires from the mimic panel to connect it to the baseboard. With Merg, eventually things were to change. But until then, I used 3-way centre-off toggle switches to power the cobalt motors, so that the motor was only powered when the switch was moved one way or the other and briefly held. This was based on my suspicion that the less stress there were on the motors, the longer they might last. However, cobalt motors I eventually accepted, are actually stall motors, so while they may take about 40 milliamps when moving, the stall current is only about 5 milliamps. So when I subsequently revamped the system with EasyBus, I used ordinary double pole, double throw switches, with the motors being continually powered. At this early stage, I powered the motors with 2 large PP9 ever-ready batteries, which are nominally rated at 5,000 milliamp hours, which is quite high. Nearly 10 years later, they're still going strong and quite usable. I've always aimed for 9 volts to power the motors. That, I think, was the original recommended voltage, although apparently the present IP digital models are quite happy with higher voltages and even AC track voltage. Just to see a bit of real running, this is the Caledonian Macintosh Class 812, number 828, hauling a coal train out of the new sidings at KIllin. It's a Bachmann model. So, at the other end of the layout, how did my Ballachulish station come about? In late 2017, we were to spend a couple of weeks in Appin, in Argyll, and while we were there, I was particularly drawn to the line opened by the same Callander and Oban Railway, but now from Oban northwards, terminating eventually in the small village of Ballachulish, after 27 miles hugging the Appin coast. In reality, of course, KIllin and Ballachulish were many miles apart, although the 2 lines were both branch line extensions of the Callander and Oban Railway. The station was opened on the 20th of August 1903 and lasted for 63 years, closing in 1966. The line branches off at Connell Ferry, northeast of Oban, to cross Loch Etive over the Connell Bridge, which apart from the Forth Railway Bridge, is the longest cantilever span in Britain, and I think possibly in Europe as well. It was originally also dualled as a road bridge. When the line was opened, it was intended to be used to carry slate away from the huge quarry that dominates the village, and also to deliver bauxite to the KIllin aluminium works at the head of Loch Leven. So the plan was to replace my KIllin fiddle yard and sector plate with a newly constructed station. I wanted to replicate the original station track plan as far as possible, although I knew it would have to be truncated as room was a bit limited. You'll see that the track layout has a twin track in the station with two platforms, a short bay platform, a signal box, goods shed, engine shed with separate turntable and a coal stage. Once again, sadly, I just did not have enough room for the turntable, and I also had to reduce the number of sidings. I'll just mention briefly about an interesting situation that arose with the track plan, specifically with the layout at the station throat. This is the first plan I came across, which seemed to be accurate, and I went on to plan and lay the track and points accordingly. Here's a picture I took as it was in the process of being laid. Only a couple of years after it was all up and running, I came across two separate signalling diagrams which showed that the station approach layout was fundamentally different from the original plan I'd used. This is one of the signalling plans. It looks similar, but you might notice that the approach to the station platform is different. Here are the two arrangements, one above the other. The lesson for me here is to do my research a bit more thoroughly. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about a few of the station structures in my modelling of Ballachulish. Most of the structures and station buildings would have to be scratch built from the mainly black and white pictures online. Subsequently, I managed to procure a number of accurate drawings of many of them through the annals of the Caledonian Railway Association, of which I'm a member, but unfortunately not before I'd already constructed them from estimations of sizes from old photos. Interestingly, the one structure that still exists, almost in its original state, is the main station building. It fell into disrepair after the line closed in 1966, following the beaching cuts. Here is a rather sad picture after the tracks had been lifted. But it was renovated in the 1990s as a medical centre, which is still in use now. This is my favourite picture of the station, with a young boy standing on the track, I suspect only days after the line closed. In modelling the station, I confess to having slightly simplified the complicated Swiss roof style typical of many of the Caledonian stations on that line, and I adapted the dimensions to fit the space I'd got available. The station building itself is actually now available in kit form as 00 gauge or O gauge by a firm called Pop-Up Designs, and their website is certainly worth looking at. Virtually all the buildings, the original buildings, were constructed of timber, in common again with many Caledonian structures. All my replicas of it are constructed from thick card, and the timber planks are either individually cut lengths of thin plasticard, or I also use Will's kits of plastic tongue and groove sheets. This is the signal box, which now has a furnished interior and a roaring fire using a flickering 3mm LED. The goods shed uses the plastic tongue and groove wheels sheets, and the strips of roof tiles come from York model rail. This is the water tank, in which I've used windows again from York model rail, and the tank is an old Kitmaster kit, now Dapple. The actual water tank building was replicated in many of the stations up the line, and the one at Cregan station, minus its steel tank, is still in use as a laundry room as part of Appin Holiday Homes. The station building and the platforms are still there, and it's well worth a visit if you're ever up in the area. In 2020, when we made our move to Fife, the layout, of course, had to be packed away and then re-erected in the garage as it is now. The previous L shape would now have to be changed to a straight end-to-end. So at this point, I decided to rework the station approach, and I completely relaid that section to get it right. It took a bit more room, but it does make operation much easier. This was the result. Quite a bit to do, as you can see, with the scenery still unfinished at this stage. Incidentally, this is how I built the hillside, with plywood formers and old newspaper packing. Next, a layer of netting to hold things together, a couple of layers of plaster bandage, a coat of brown paint to cover any gaps, and then covered with hanging basket liner. I think it's made out of jute. Static grass will finish it off. There's still quite a bit more to do here, as you can see on that picture. A bit more running. This is the Gresley J38 hauling 3 Caledonian coaches out of Ballachulish station. In 2017, I joined Merg. It was a good move. At one of the meetings I attended in the Scout Hall in Glasgow, Davey did a presentation on EasyBus, and I was fortunate to be able to buy one of the initial £12 packs to test it out. The result would be that the new station boards at Ballachulish could now benefit from points being controlled by servos using EasyBus. I'd already experimented with using the Servo 4 kit, but EasyBus was expandable. For the 25 points I now have on the whole layout on 6 separate baseboards, the system is ideal. As I mentioned earlier, all the Pico points are electrofrog, and I use relays to change the polarities of the frogs. So, associated with each baseboard, and Ballachulish has 3 baseboards, is a bank of 12-volt relays fed from the EasyBus output module, which you can see in this picture. Just a further word on wiring electrofrog points. Before I fix them in place on the baseboard, I always make a modification to ensure that the passage of a loco across the point won't cause a short circuit between the blades of the point and the running rails. This can easily happen, particularly on a smaller radius point, or if you're running older locos with wider flanges. And with DCC, even a few milliseconds of a short circuit can cause problems, such as locos running away out of control. I know this because it's happened to me. So this modification involves cutting the link between the two blades and the frog as shown here. And secondly, wiring each of the blades permanently to its adjacent running rail with a common dropper as shown here. Although the blades might still get power from touching the running rails, they're not now dependent on that, and the supply is now more reliable. If the point blade is dirty, it'll still work. Just a further thought on mimic panels that I mentioned earlier. The layout has two panels, one for each station. The two full panel frames are slightly different sizes, but both the mimic plans themselves are based on thin plywood of A4 size. The track plan was drawn out on computer using an Apple Mac Pages program and printed onto photographic paper. The appropriate holes for the switches and the LEDs were then marked and transferred through onto the plywood underneath. The plywood was then drilled and the switches and LEDs fitted. This is a Ballachulish panel in the picture here, with the LEDs indicating point orientation. And here is the underside of the board, which, as you can see, includes the circuitry for EasyBus, showing the two input modules. I also mounted the both panels on drawer runners, which I've found works very well. At this stage, all my KIllin points were still working with cobalts, as I mentioned before, and there were still those 30 wire cables connecting to the mimic panel, and no sign of EasyBus on this part of the layout at all. So that needed to change. I didn't think that there would be any particular advantage in replacing cobalts with servos because they were working quite well, but they needed to be controlled by EasyBus. Now, the circuit that Davey gives in his EasyBus manual to operate tortoise motors is the one shown here with a DP-DT relay. And for my 10 points at KIllin, that would need to be replicated 10 times. In early 2020, during COVID, getting hold of multi-channel DP-DT relays was actually not possible without waiting for months for them to come from China. So I resorted to building them myself on stripboard using single units which were easily available, and this is the result. Now, I had two further issues to deal with. Firstly, my preference, as I mentioned before, rightly or wrongly, was to run the cobalt motors on a reduced 9-volt supply, mainly to lengthen their lifespan. And secondly, more seriously, I discovered a problem which affected switch on of the cobalts from the EasyBus system. When EasyBus was switched on initially, it caused all the 10 cobalts to start up and run from one end of travel to the other and back again. Actually, it was very noisy. Not ideal also, of course, if a rolling stock was sitting over the points. So what was needed was to delay the 9-volt power to the relay modules until EasyBus had settled. Powering up the whole layout with up to 4 EasyBus input modules, 6 output modules and 25 points in total. The time it took to settle was between 10 and 15 seconds. A sequencer kit, PMP26, seemed to be the best solution, and a 15-second delay on that was set. And once installed, the cobalts behaved themselves and didn't make a move until they were intended to, of course. So this is the schematic plan. The digital outputs on the servo module on the top left feeds down into the DP-DT relay unit, and from there on to the cobalt motors. And the separate 9-volt supply also feeds into the relay unit. The sequencer makes sure that the 9 volts is only delivered after 15 seconds. The actual unit seen here was built on plywood and was screwed onto the underside of the baseboard. You can see the relay unit on the left and the outputs to the cobalt motors along the bottom. In the centre there's the EasyBus output module, and at the top is the PM-Key 6 kit, which supplies the 9 volts for the motors using a 7809 voltage regulator instead of the normal 7812. And at the right hand side is the sequencer. Here's the underside of the baseboard showing the unit on the top left. Also, just out of interest, this shows the arrangement for moving both of the station crossover points using only one motor. This is a clip from a video that some of you might have seen, describing the operation of 3-way points using push buttons with the circuitry which David designed. The necessity for a 3-way point on the layout is due to a very recent extension, which answers a need for extra siding space. And even though the extension itself is far from finished, as you can see, the 3-way point works well with servos. Here's the new revamped KIllin Mimic board with the 3-way point at the bottom left with its push buttons, and here's the underside showing David's circuit board at the top left, and to the right of that 2 EasyBus input modules. Just to finish with, a couple of quite brief topics: signals and loco decoders. Signalling is one of the next aspects I want to improve on in the layout. So far, there's only one working double post semaphore signal on the layout, and that's at the Ballachulish platform end. It's powered by a couple of servos, and at the moment is not in any way automated, although I'm thinking about that for the future. It's using the dual mount servo kit 685, and after some fiddling and adjusting, it works quite well, albeit it's difficult to encourage a decent signal bounce on the arm. I have my thoughts about that, but at any rate, it's a beginning. Secondly, on decoders, from experience I've found that not all loco decoders are the same. Some are very good and some are poor. I fitted 2 of my locos, the Ginty and a Thomson 264, with supposedly reputable decoders, not sound in those cases, and I had constant problems trying to get them to run slowly and smoothly. Slow running on the layout is vital for obvious reasons. Not long ago, I was advised to replace them with another brand, and I have to say that the difference in running was remarkable. Here's the Ginty running now. So get good advice when buying them. 2 of my locos, the Macintosh 828 and the Gresley LNER J38, which is a Southeast Finecast kit I built back in 2016, do have sound decoders. Generally, you pay another £100 or so to fit sound to a loco, but the difference in running experience is really quite dramatic. In conclusion, I'll just say that over the years, my layout has given me a lot of pleasure and continues to do so. I possibly spend more time building it and trying to perfect it than I do actually running it, although my recent foray into the world of sound decoders has added an extra dimension to running, as opposed to playing trains. Railway modelling involves so many aspects: history, woodwork, travelling, storytelling, imagination, sharing with others, and electronics is another vital element of that spectrum, and one which I very much enjoy. So, thanks for watching, and if there are any questions, I'll do my best.